John had always been a man of routine, quiet and reserved, living a life that seemed ordinary on the outside, but was deeply fulfilling to him. He worked as an accountant in a small office, where his days consisted of numbers, spreadsheets, and deadlines. He was a simple man with simple pleasures. He loved his morning coffee, reading books in the evening, and spending weekends in the garden. There was a sense of tranquility in his life, though sometimes John felt like something was missing. He couldn't quite place it, an unshakable feeling that something was out of alignment. He had no known health issues. He was in his late 40s, not overly active, but not sedentary either. John had never worried much about his health. He wasn't one to visit doctors often, preferring to deal with minor ailments on his own. However, in the weeks leading up to the event that would change his life forever, he began to feel an odd sensation in his chest, a light pressure that seemed to come and go, often when he was stressed. He brushed it off as anxiety, something that came with the pressures of work and life. But the signs were starting to accumulate. The pressure felt different now. It was persistent, nagging at him, but it wasn't painful, so he ignored it. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the weeks passed, John started noticing other strange signs that he couldn't ignore. His energy was low, far lower than usual. He would wake up in the morning feeling exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all, despite having a full night's rest. His routine walks around the neighborhood felt like a chore now, his legs heavy and his breath shallow. It was unlike him to feel this way. One evening, after a long day at work, he collapsed onto the couch, utterly drained. His left arm tingled, a sensation that seemed to run all the way down to his fingers. The sensation was faint, almost like an electric shock, but it left him uneasy. Maybe I'm just tired, he thought to himself, trying to shake off the unease. But something about it didn't feel right. As days passed, John began to experience more troubling signs. He would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. He'd been having trouble catching his breath even when sitting still, and there were times when he felt dizzy for no apparent reason, his vision blurring for a few seconds before it cleared again. The pressure in his chest seemed to increase, and though it wasn't painful, it was undeniable. It was like a slow, relentless tightening that never seemed to let up. In his quiet moments, when he wasn't trying to distract himself with work or television, John would reflect on his life. He was happy, he thought, but something inside him kept nagging at him, as though warning him about something he couldn't see. He couldn't explain it, but he sensed that his life was about to change in a way he couldn't control. It was the strange, unshakable feeling that there was an impending crisis, a warning sign that he couldn't ignore. And then, the night came when everything would change. It happened one evening as John sat on the couch, absently watching the news. He felt a sudden wave of dizziness, stronger than before. His heart seemed to race in his chest, and his breathing became shallow, almost labored. He reached for his phone to call for help, but as he picked it up, he noticed something that stopped him dead in his tracks. There, in the corner of the room, in the faintest shadow, he felt a presence. It wasn't something he saw with his eyes. It was a deep knowing, an awareness that something or someone was there with him, but not in a way that was tangible. The air around him seemed to thicken, and a calmness washed over him, despite the fear that was beginning to bubble up inside him. John tried to shake off the strange feeling, but it remained steady and reassuring. There was something comforting about this presence, as though it was guiding him, protecting him in that moment. His mind raced. He had never believed in angels or the supernatural. He had always been a skeptic, grounded in logic and reason. But this was different. The presence seemed to be nudging him gently, urging him to calm down, to breathe deeply, to relax. He closed his eyes and followed its subtle guidance. For the first time in what felt like forever, John felt at peace. The racing thoughts in his mind slowed, and his breath returned to a steady rhythm. The pressure in his chest didn't go away, but the panic that had gripped him was gone. He no longer felt alone. He was in the presence of something far greater, far more powerful than anything he could understand. And for the first time, he knew that he wasn't facing this alone. It was a quiet evening when the crisis unfolded. John had just finished a long day at work and decided to take a walk in the neighborhood to clear his mind. The pressure in his chest had been growing steadily, but he had dismissed it as nothing more than stress. As he walked, each step felt heavier than the last. He tried to ignore the tightness in his chest, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. By the time he reached the small park at the end of his block, John felt an overwhelming sensation of nausea wash over him. His legs felt weak, his knees trembling. He tried to take a deep breath, but his chest seemed to tighten more, as though something was squeezing his heart. The sudden pain in his chest startled him, a sharp, searing discomfort that left him gasping for air. John stumbled to the nearest bench, clutching his chest in a desperate attempt to steady himself. His thoughts were racing. He knew something was terribly wrong. The pain intensified, radiating down his left arm and into his jaw, and his breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. His vision blurred, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "I need to call for help," he thought, but his body felt like it was betraying him. His fingers trembled as he fumbled for his phone, but before he could dial, his hand fell limply to his side. The pain surged again, and John's head spun as he collapsed forward, unable to keep himself upright. The world around him seemed to fade. In that moment, John could feel the weight of his life pressing down on him. How all the missed signs, the ignored warnings, had led to this moment. Was this the end? Was he really going to die alone on this bench in the park? His heart felt like it was slowing down, each beat more distant than the last. His body was shutting down, and a terrifying sense of helplessness overtook him. The pain seemed unbearable, and yet, through the agony, there was something strange. Despite the overwhelming sense of fear and despair, there was an undercurrent of peace that seemed to echo in the background, like a whispering promise. John's body finally gave in, and he slumped forward, his head resting against the wooden arm of the bench. His chest constricted tighter, each heartbeat now a laborious effort. The crushing weight in his chest intensified as he tried to force a breath, but no air seemed to fill his lungs. The cold sweat continued to pour down his face, and his fingers grew numb. His mind raced, but his thoughts were growing muddled, like wading through fog. The world seemed to spin, a dizzying blur of lights and shadows, and for a moment, John could no longer make sense of what was happening. His limbs felt heavy, and his mind started to cloud over. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here or what he should do next. The panic in his chest grew, as though it were swallowing him whole, suffocating him. But it wasn't just the physical pain that tortured him. It was the emotional turmoil that was accompanying it, the sheer terror of knowing that this could be the end. The thought of leaving his life unfinished, never getting the chance to see his loved ones again, filled him with regret. The quiet, simple life he had lived seemed so trivial now. John had always played it safe, never taking risks or stepping outside his comfort zone. Was it too late to change? Was there something more he should have done with his life? His thoughts were a jumbled mess, an overwhelming wave of self-doubt and sorrow. He couldn't stop thinking about the missed opportunities, the things he wished he had done differently, and the relationships he had neglected. His emotions swirled, a mix of fear, sadness, and regret. But then, just as the panic seemed to reach its peak, something changed. It was as if the darkness that had overtaken his mind suddenly parted, and he felt a strange calmness begin to settle over him. Amid the chaos and pain, a sudden, inexplicable sense of peace washed over John. It was as if the world had slowed down, and the fear that had consumed him started to dissolve. He could feel the weight of his body, but he no longer felt like he was sinking into it. There was a lightness, a feeling that something or someone was lifting him from the depths of his suffering. In that moment, John heard a voice, a soft whisper, not from the outside, but from within, like a gentle nudge in his mind. It wasn't a voice he could place, but it was unmistakably comforting. The voice wasn't loud or commanding, but calm and patient, as if it had been there all along, waiting for him to listen. "Breathe, John," it said, soothing and firm. "You're not alone. You will be okay." He wasn't sure where the voice came from, but the words filled him with a sense of calm he had never known before. It was as though the voice was not just telling him to breathe, but guiding him, reminding him that there was still time to heal. He tried to focus on the words, to hold on to them, and in doing so, something miraculous began to happen. His breathing, which had been erratic and shallow, began to slow and deepen. The tightness in his chest loosened bit by bit. The pain, though still present, no longer felt as overwhelming. It was as if he had been given a second chance, and that presence, whatever it was helping him navigate through it. As John struggled to remain conscious, his thoughts began to drift in and out, torn between fear and a strange, newfound sense of calm. His body still felt heavy, but now there was an odd sense of detachment from it, almost as if he wasn't fully present in the physical world anymore. The pain was still there, but it seemed muffled by something far greater than the agony he had been experiencing moments before. He closed his eyes, not out of despair, but in an attempt to surrender, to let go of the frantic thoughts that had been overwhelming him. The rational mind, which had once been so dominant, now seemed distant. The constant worry, the self-doubt, and the fears that had plagued his life suddenly faded into the background. In that quiet space, he allowed himself to accept what was happening. There was no longer any need to fight or resist. He realized, with a startling clarity, that perhaps he didn't have to control everything. He could not control what was happening to his body, nor could he change the outcome. But in this moment, he could choose to release the tension and let whatever was unfolding take its course. The pain seemed to dull, and instead of feeling fear, he began to feel an overwhelming wave of surrender. It was as if the very act of letting go brought him closer to something, or someone, that was watching over him. The sense of control he had once clung to was no longer necessary. John wasn't sure if it was a physical act or an emotional one, but with each breath he took, he allowed himself to drift deeper into the unknown. It was terrifying to admit that he had no answers, but something in the depths of his soul knew that this surrender was exactly what he needed to do. The strangest thing happened next. The more he surrendered, the less he felt alone. The quiet in his mind, once filled with panic and regret, was replaced with an almost comforting presence. And then something shifted. As John allowed himself to fall deeper into the stillness of the moment, the pain in his chest began to fade. It wasn't gone completely, but the pressure that had seemed suffocating began to feel distant, as if it was no longer his burden to carry alone. His mind, once clouded with fear, seemed to clear, and in that clarity, a vision began to take shape. At first, it was subtle, a faint glow, like the softest light shining through a veil of mist. John didn't open his eyes, not out of fear, but because he didn't want to break the tranquility that had settled over him. Instead, he allowed the glow to guide him, a presence so gentle, so familiar, that it felt like a long-lost friend returning home. The light seemed to envelop him, spreading through every fiber of his being. And then, the vision became clearer. A figure, radiant and warm, appeared before him. It wasn't something that could be fully explained in human terms. It wasn't a man or a woman. It was simply light, pure and unconditional, but there was an unmistakable form to it. The figure was ethereal, but its presence was undeniable. It felt both calming and powerful at the same time. John didn't question what he was seeing. There was no need to. Everything in him seemed to recognize this being, even if his rational mind couldn't comprehend the details. The figure exuded warmth, peace, and a deep sense of love. The love wasn't just for John, but for all of existence. It was the kind of love that couldn't be measured or defined. It was infinite, unconditional, and all-encompassing. The angel's presence filled him with a sense of safety. He could feel its energy surrounding him, like a gentle embrace, supporting him through the chaos that had been his physical body moments before. The figure didn't speak at first, but its presence spoke volumes, calming his heart, easing the tension in his chest, and flooding his mind with a profound sense of peace. John could hear the angel's thoughts, not in words, but as feelings, as if their communication transcended language itself. He felt the angel's gentle reassurance, a sense of knowing that everything would be okay. The overwhelming feeling of fear and despair that had once consumed him was now replaced with acceptance, understanding, and surrender. The angel communicated something deeply personal to John, but there were no words, just the comforting sensation of knowing. He felt that the angel was reminding him that this was not the end, that there was still so much more for him to experience, to live for. The pain he had been feeling was merely a temporary experience in the vastness of his soul's journey. As John continued to surrender, the light from the angel grew brighter, but it wasn't blinding. It was warm and enveloping, filling him with a sense of serenity. There was no more fear, no more pain, just peace. And then, as if the angel was guiding him through the darkness of the unknown, John felt a rush of pure, unbridled love. It wasn't just a feeling. It was an energy that surged through his entire being. It was the love of something far greater than he could comprehend, the kind of love that healed all wounds and erased all fears. It was in that moment, surrounded by this angelic presence, that John knew he was safe. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to fight anymore. The surrender had led him here, into the embrace of something divine. John couldn't explain it, nor did he need to. The angel, in all its loving power, had shown him that there was a higher force at work, a force that was guiding him not just through this life-threatening experience, but through every aspect of his existence. The physical world, with all its struggles and pain, seemed distant now. He was floating in a sea of peace, completely enveloped by the angel's presence. In this sacred moment, John realized that he wasn't just surviving. He was being transformed. As John continued to rest in the angel's presence, the weight of the pain began to dissipate. The tightness in his chest, which had once felt like a vice squeezing the life out of him, slowly began to release. It was as if the very air around him had changed, becoming lighter, easier to breathe. The suffocating pressure that had seemed so relentless was now a distant memory. He could feel the blood flowing freely through his veins, a sense of warmth spreading from his heart outward, as if the very core of his being had been healed. At first, the sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible. His body felt lighter, but he wasn't entirely sure if it was his imagination or the reality of his recovery. However, as the minutes passed, the clarity grew. The heavy weight in his chest had lifted, replaced by a sensation of fluidity and ease. His heart, which moments ago had seemed to falter with each beat, was now beating steadily and calmly. It wasn't just the absence of pain that felt miraculous. It was the incredible lightness that filled his entire being. Every breath he took felt like a deep sigh of relief. His body, once so rigid and strained with tension, now seemed to be glowing with an energy that he hadn't known he possessed. There was a lightness to his limbs, a buoyancy that felt foreign yet comforting. John wasn't sure how it was happening, whether it was the result of his surrender to the unknown or the angelic presence that surrounded him. But in this moment, he felt reborn. He wasn't sure if he had died and been reborn, or if this was simply the result of divine intervention, but he knew without a doubt that he was no longer the same person. His connection to the physical pain he had endured seemed like a distant memory, a past life, as if he had been given a second chance. The sense of lightness that filled him was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, and mental. Every part of him felt cleansed, as though a weight had been lifted from his soul. The fear and anxiety that had once governed his life had no place here. For the first time in a long while, John felt complete. As he lay there, in the warmth of the angel's light, a profound realization began to emerge. He was no longer a victim of his circumstances or his physical body. He was more than the sum of his fears, his doubts, and his pain. He was something greater, something that could not be defined by earthly terms. The angel's presence had unlocked something within him, something he had always known but had never truly understood. As John basked in this newfound likeness, the presence of the angel seemed to grow even more profound. It wasn't just the angel's radiance that filled the room now. It was the sense of love, care, and wisdom that poured out from the being. John could feel the angel's energy in every corner of the room, but there was something more, something that seemed to beckon him deeper into the experience. Then, as if answering an unspoken question in his mind, a voice echoed softly within him. It wasn't a loud, commanding voice. It was gentle, yet firm, a voice that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of his being, bypassing the intellect and speaking directly to his soul. "Do not fear," the voice said, not with words, but with feelings. "You are not alone, and this moment was not your end, but your beginning." John couldn't explain how, but the words resonated deep within his soul. It wasn't just a message. It was a truth that felt undeniable. As the voice continued, he felt the subtle vibrations of its wisdom settle into his very bones. "You have always been guided," the voice whispered, "but you have forgotten. You have been blinded by the illusion of separation, by the fear of your own imperfection. But now you know that you are never truly alone. You are always loved, always watched over." John's heart swelled with emotion as these words soaked into him. He had spent so much of his life feeling like an outsider, always disconnected from others and from the world around him. He had felt like he was constantly fighting, struggling to find his place, to belong. But here, in this sacred moment, the angel's voice was telling him that all along he had been part of something much greater than himself, something infinite, something that could never be broken. The angel's guidance continued to flow through him, not in commands or instructions, but in gentle reminders of the truth he had always known deep inside, but had long forgotten. "You are more than the sum of your experiences," the angel's voice spoke. "Your true essence is not bound by time or space. It is love, and it is infinite. You have been given this life to remember who you are, to live fully, to love deeply, to be the light that you seek." John felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over him. For the first time in his life, he understood the profound significance of the moment he was experiencing. This wasn't just about surviving a heart attack. This was about awakening, about remembering the divine truth of who he was. The voice, which seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, spoke with the power of pure love, urging John to see beyond the physical world and to reconnect with his spiritual essence. "You have the power to heal," the voice continued. "But to do so, you must let go of fear. Fear has been your greatest limitation. When you let go of fear, you open yourself to the endless possibilities that exist beyond this realm. You are not a victim of your circumstances. You are the creator of your reality." The angel's words resonated in every cell of John's being, and he knew with absolute certainty that this message was meant for him. He had spent too long focusing on what was wrong with his life, on what he lacked and what he feared. Now the angel was showing him the truth. He was not powerless. He had the power to create, to heal, and to be a beacon of light in the world. The angel's guidance didn't end with words. It continued to fill him with a profound sense of peace and purpose. John felt a deep inner knowing that he had been given this second chance for a reason. He was meant to live a life of purpose, a life of healing, and a life of love. The angel had shown him the way, and now it was up to him to follow. With each word of the angel's guidance, John felt his spirit soar. The heaviness of his past was lifting, and in its place, a new chapter was beginning to unfold. As John slowly rose from his bed, the weight of what had just occurred settled over him. The pain, the suffocating pressure in his chest, and the terror that had nearly consumed him seemed like a distant memory now, almost surreal. How had he survived such a terrifying ordeal? How had the events unfolded so rapidly, yet so miraculously, in his favor? He still couldn't quite comprehend the full magnitude of what had happened. What he knew for certain was that he had been touched by something extraordinary, something divine. The doctors had been baffled. Their scans and reports showed that John should not have survived. His heart had been on the verge of collapse. The severity of the attack had been overwhelming. But here he was, alive, feeling stronger and more vibrant than ever before. There was no medical explanation for it, no logical reason why he had walked out of that hospital room when others in similar circumstances hadn't. The only explanation that made sense to him now was that he had been saved by an unseen force, something far beyond human understanding. The miracle of survival wasn't just about the physical recovery, though. Yes, his body had healed faster than anyone expected, but the true miracle lay in the way his soul had been touched. The very fact that he was alive was a miracle in itself, but the gift of peace, clarity, and spiritual awakening that had come with it was even more profound. He had been given a second chance at life, not just to breathe again, but to live with purpose, with intention, and with a deeper understanding of his place in the world. John's survival was not just a result of luck or chance. He knew in his heart that it was a divine intervention, a miracle orchestrated by something greater than himself. And for that, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. His survival wasn't just about escaping death. It was about being given the opportunity to live a life that truly mattered. A life that was not weighed down by fear or regret, but elevated by a higher understanding of love, purpose, and connection. As John reflected on his miraculous survival, he couldn't help but feel awe at the sheer beauty of life itself. Even in its darkest moments, there was light. Even in the depths of despair, there was hope. His survival had shown him that life was a precious gift, and every breath, every moment, was a miracle waiting to be embraced. The experience had changed John in ways he could never have anticipated. It wasn't just the physical healing that had transformed him. It was the profound shift in his perspective on life. Before the heart attack, John had been consumed by the daily grind, the pressures of work, and the constant pursuit of success. He had lived his life on autopilot, focused on external achievements, never fully aware of the deeper currents that guided his soul. But now, everything had changed. John could no longer see life the same way. The illusion of control, the frantic rush to accomplish more, and the obsession with material success seemed so trivial in comparison to the deeper truths he had discovered. He had learned that the true essence of life was not about achieving accolades or acquiring things. It was about living authentically, being present in each moment, and embracing the divine guidance that was always available to him. The heart attack had forced him to confront his mortality, and in doing so, it had awakened him to the eternal nature of his soul. He had realized that his true purpose was not bound by the limitations of the physical world. He was here for a greater reason: to experience love, to share light, and to walk a path of spiritual growth. John had learned to let go of the constant need for control. He had learned that surrendering to the flow of life, rather than fighting against it, was the key to peace. The heart attack had shown him that life was unpredictable, and it was in embracing uncertainty that he found freedom. He had discovered the beauty of living in the present moment, without dwelling on the past or fearing the future. Every breath he took now felt like a blessing, a reminder that life was a precious gift. This new perspective on life had rippled through every aspect of John's existence. His relationships were more meaningful, his work more purposeful, and his connection to his inner self deeper than ever before. The lessons he had learned were profound, and he knew that he would carry them with him for the rest of his life. As John stood by the window, gazing out at the world with a sense of renewed wonder, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His journey had been nothing short of miraculous, and he knew that he owed everything to the angelic presence that had guided him through the darkest moments of his life. The angel had not only saved him physically, but had also shown him the path to spiritual awakening. the guidance, the love, the unwavering support. John knew that he would never be able to fully repay this divine gift, but he was determined to live in a way that honored it every day. Every decision, every action from this point forward would be infused with the wisdom the angel had imparted. He closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer of thanks to the angel who had intervened when he needed it most. John didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was no longer afraid. The presence of the angel had shown him that he was never truly alone, and that there was always a higher power watching over him. With that knowledge, he felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude settle into his heart. Every breath he took from this moment forward would be a reminder of the angel's love and the miraculous second chance he had been given.